Starting in verse 9. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. In 1955, Ford began a radical and daring move to create a new car line unlike any other. Its looks were truly one of a kind, and it had standard and optional equipment never before seen on a production car. The car would be called the Edsel. Some of you are familiar with that name. You know, for those of you who are not familiar with an Edsel, it was a spin-off of the Ford Motor Company that only lasted 3 years. It was and still is considered one of the major failures in the automotive industry. It was a huge investment that just didn't sell. And when Ford finally pulled the plug, they had sold less than half of the cars needed just to break even. You know, throughout the car's production, there were visible signs that this car was going to be a flop. You know, many of the higher-ups at Ford could already see the writing on the wall. It simply was a wrong car for the time period. You know, America was in a recession, and there was no use for this expensive sedan. So Ford got the idea that if they could target Americans with an aggressive ad campaign, then people would buy the car. And that's what they did. But when they revealed the car in late 1957, people just weren't interested. You know, the car just did not live up to the expectations. And when Ford finally closed down the Edsel line, they had lost, in our dollar today, $2.3 billion. You know, the Edsel project was one of the most expensive mistakes ever committed by a car company. And it jeopardized the financial stability of the Ford Motor Company. Now, for us today, the Edsel teaches a very valuable lesson, and that is to be very careful where you invest your money. And whether that's investing in a promising venture or even investing in people. Now, it might sound strange, but when we help those who are in need, we are, in some ways, investing in those people. You know, we're not investing in hopes of getting something in return. You know, we're investing in people, hoping that they will, in turn, be a blessing to others. That's a topic we're going to look at tonight. You know, Paul is going to conclude his list of qualifications for widows receiving help from the church. And as we will see, it is only those widows who show promise of being a blessing to others that the church must look after. You know, investing in any other widows would have been a huge waste of the church's resources. You know, so with all this in mind, we come to our first point as we consider the precondition for charity. Verse 9, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. You know, God has always made provision for the needy. You know, all throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, we consistently find God looking after widows, orphans, the oppressed, and the poor. Psalm 68:5 says that God is a father of the fatherless and a defender of widows. That should indicate to us that he takes the matter very serious, and so should we. The widows within the church need to be looked after. That is, if they meet the qualifications. Now, to be taken into the number meant she was put on the list of widows that the church would regularly support. And she would then receive all the necessary things for day-to-day living. And there are two requirements listed here for a widow being put on the list. There was an age requirement and a moral requirement. Now, she had to be at least 60 years old, and she needed to have a clean marriage record. Now, we don't know exactly what the average life expectancy was for a first-century man or woman, but from the little evidence that we do have, it appears that a person did well to live past 50 years of age. But people just didn't live into old age like we do today. Now, there was a lot working against you in the first century. Things that kept lifespans relatively short. There were wars, sickness, infections, infant mortality rates of nearly 30%, as well as just all-around unhealthy living conditions. A 60-year-old woman from the first century would be more comparable to a 90-year-old woman today. A woman did well to live into her 60s, and if she happened to make it that far, she likely didn't have many years left. And it was unlikely that she would remarry. And this freed up a lot of her time to be actively serving the church. And this is what would be expected of her, because there appears to have been an unwritten agreement that the widows would serve the church in whatever capacity they could. Now, the other requirement was that she must be the wife of one man. This meant she needed to have a clean marriage record. Now, it doesn't appear that Paul is condemning a widow who remarried after her first husband died. It is the issue of divorce and remarriage that is in view here. It was inappropriate then, as it is now, for a man or woman to leave their spouse and marry another. And there certainly are special circumstances that should be considered. But to leave one's spouse for any old reason was and still is wrong. If a widow had a history of this sort of behavior, then it was cause for her to be disqualified from receiving help from the church. Now, a qualified widow was one who had been faithful to her husband. Verse 10, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. Now, she must have a reputation for doing good. Her selflessness and kindness towards others should be evident. The church's resources were not for the ungodly widows who simply wanted a handout. It was reserved for the widows who loved the Lord and his people. If she has brought up children, this could be referring to her raising up her own children. And it is also very likely that Paul is referring to her having raised orphans. It was a common practice during the Roman period for parents of newborns to reject a child. If a child was rejected, they would often be left in a certain part of town. This was a location for abandoned children. And at this point, the child either died or was adopted by someone. Quite often, they were adopted by slave owners, raised, and then put to work as slaves. Now, to give you some insight into this mindset, I found a letter written during this time period. It was written by a Roman man to his expecting wife. He tells her to keep the child if it is a male, and to reject it if it is a female. It goes like this. Hilarion to Alice, heartiest greetings. Know that we are still even now in Alexandria. I beg and beseech of you to take care of the little child, and as soon as we receive wages, I will send them to you. If good luck to you, you bear offspring, and it is a male, let it live. If it is a female, expose it. To expose a child meant to leave it in that certain part of town for it to either die or become adopted. Now, Christians were known for adopting these unwanted children and raising them. Oftentimes a Christian woman who was widowed would raise up several of these children. It was a very selfless thing to do, and it was also a very effective area of ministry. For a widow to have raised orphan children revealed something of her character. And this is likely what Paul was referring to. Now, Paul goes on to further qualify a widow when he said, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted. Well, this demonstrated something very important about this woman. She had a servant's heart. She was willing to do the work of a servant. She didn't see these important tasks as being beneath her. It is these character traits that separate the godly widow from all the rest. Those simply looking for a handout would not exemplify this level of love and care for others. Those who lived for pleasure were nothing more than self-seekers. They did as they pleased, but the godly widow lived to serve others and not herself. Now, these are the widows whom Paul expected the church to support. Verse 11, but refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry. Younger widows were not likely to be committed to serving the church to the same degree that older widows would. And because of their youth, they were more likely to have family members who could help support them. They were also more likely to get remarried. Younger men and women naturally have more worldly pursuits than the older generations. From 20 years old to 50 years old, you're predominantly involved in your career, your marriage, and raising your family. At that stage, life is still fun. There are always new experiences just waiting around the corner, and your body is still able and willing to enjoy these things. But after 50, I'm told, you begin to focus on the things that matter to you the most. They say it's because you now realize the brevity of life. Now, for many Christians, this is the time that they begin to serve their local church more faithfully. That only makes sense that a younger widow would desire the natural pursuits of young people. Remarriage, children, managing a home. To take a young widow and put her on the list of assisted widows would place far too much time on her hands. And she would likely not have the same desire to serve her church as an older widow would. And not necessarily because she is more sinful, but because she is simply in a different stage of life. Her interest would naturally be to remarry and have a family. Devoting a considerable portion of her time to serving would not come natural to her. And the result could potentially be that she dismisses her obligation to the church. Verse 12, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. An able widow who was supported by the church was expected to display an attitude of servitude, in whatever capacity she could. Now, if you remember from last week, one of the things she was expected to do was to take up a ministry of prayer. And for an older widow who was very godly, serving the church would be a very natural thing for her to do, especially when you consider the time she would have on her hands. But naturally, the younger widow would eventually want to remarry, raise up a family, and this pursuit would have taken up much of her time, and she would not be able to minister in the church to the same degree. She would essentially be renouncing her prior obligation to serving the church. This is likely what Paul meant when he said the younger widows would cast off their first faith. Making a vow to serve the church, then not following through is never a good thing. And this is why it is better to reserve the church's resources for the the older godly widows who could devote their days to serving. Verse 13, And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. You know, receiving charity when you don't need it causes one to become idle. When all your material needs are met, you don't need to earn a living. And when you don't need to earn a living, you have a lot of time on your hands. You know, if a young widow is cared for by the church, she will naturally become very idle. You know, without a husband or children or a home to keep up, she would have too much time in her hands. And when you have too much time on your hands, you will inevitably find things to do. You know, some good, but some bad. You know, there's a direct connection between idleness and sin. You know, quite often when one has too much time on their hands, they get involved in some sort of sin. You know, for a young widow, there would be that temptation to get involved with gossip. That's likely what Paul is implying here. You know, the problem here is that young widows have the tendency to become gossips and busybodies when they are taken care of by the church. Now, being gossips and busybodies and wandering from house to house is not a good way to live a fruitful and productive life. In fact, it is incredibly harmful to the unity of the church. You know, one commentator says this: one doesn't have to be a young widow to fulfill the description of this verse. Those who spend much time talking about other people's lives need to get a life of their own. It is no sin in any case to marry, bear children, and take care of a family. But it is a sin in every case to be idle persons, gadders about, tattlers, busybodies, sifting out and detailing family secrets. You know, gossip is deadly. And unfortunately, there have been many pastors, leaders, and good men and women in the church over the years who have had their reputation tarnished by those who partake in malicious gossip. You know, it can cause friends to become enemies. Families can be at odds with one another, and churches can actually become divided. It is one of the leading causes of conflict within churches today. It is most often caused by those who have too much time on their hands. You know, people who need to learn to be content with the matters of their own lives. Or as that commentator said, they need to get a life of their own. You know, when I was in elementary school, it was a big thing back then to say to people, you know, get a life. I don't hear that much anymore, but I thought of that when I read that commentary. Verse 14. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. That would be the natural thing to do. You know, a widow who is still relatively young can still remarry and have children. This is likely the best course of action for her. It also would likely be the very thing that she would desire to do. You know, being a younger woman, she will naturally be drawn to the family life. She will want a husband and children and a home. And she would be unfit for the role of older widows who devote their lives to serving the church. A woman who bears children and manages the house is doing the very thing God has designed her to do. Now, certainly not every woman will have children, but the majority do tend to, and that is what Paul is addressing. So it is far better for the younger widows to remarry than to be supported by the church, because as verse 13 indicates, they would have a tendency to become gossips. And taking part in gossip is to live in disobedience. And living in disobedience gives place to the devil. It's like allowing him into your living room to have control over some areas of your life. And the devil takes delight in a woman who loves gossip. He can use her to sow all sorts of discord amongst an assembly of believers. This is why Paul is admonishing young widows to better occupy their time. Verse 15, for some have already turned aside after Satan. Some of the younger widows known by Paul had gone in a rather bad direction in their lives. They had erred and were now in a backslidden condition. He likely was referring to widows who had become gossips and busybodies, as well as the widows who had renounced their prior obligations of serving the church. Then there was the ever-present problem of immorality. It is quite possible that Paul was also referring to the younger widows who had become involved in an immoral relationship. The city of Ephesus was a place where immorality of all sorts was freely and openly practiced. Illicit relationships were the norm, and there would have been great temptation for any young person. Whatever the case might be, they had left the lifestyle of discernment and followed after temptation. Paul has made it clear that only the qualified widows should receive support from the church. Those who were of the right age and who met certain character requirements. Now Paul is going to direct his attention on those who are obligated to care for the widows themselves. This was necessary because the church's resources could only stretch so far. That is why those in leadership must know and understand the appropriate use of assets. Verse 16, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Believing family members were expected to take care of their widows. If you had the means to support them, then the responsibility was yours, not the church's. There weren't any wealthy churches in Ephesus. Certainly nothing that would compare to our modern-day megachurches. Resources were often scarce, so the church could only realistically care for the widows who truly had no other means. That is why family members needed to care for their own widows. Family must look out for family. That was the expectation, and it is still true today. Now, this principle does not apply only to widows. If someone within our immediate family has fallen in hard times, then we must do what we can to help. And the same care and consideration should also be extended to our fellow believers. An unexpected illness, medical bills, or a loss of employment can sometimes bring about financial devastation. It is times like these that Christians can serve one another. But we must be careful, because not everyone who seeks help is truly needy. We cannot afford to throw our money and resources at everyone who asks. Just like the widows, those whom we help should be qualified. We as individuals as well as a church should not waste resources on unqualified persons. And it's important that we distinguish between those who truly need help and those who are simply looking for a handout. Now, there are plenty of men and women and even whole families who know how to get what they want or need without having to earn it. Well, unfortunately, churches, as well as individual Christians, can sometimes be taken advantage of by these types. They act as leeches, taking everything they can until they wear out their welcome, and then they move on to another church. They can care for themselves, but they choose not to. Their motto is, why work when I can get handouts? It is these types of people that we are not obligated to help. There's a lot in this passage that we can all relate to. But I believe the underlying point that we must take home is that it's important that we know who we are obligated to help and care for. Our immediate family, yes, of course. We are responsible to care for them when the time comes. Now, this has always been God's will. But what about others? What about other believers who have fallen in hard times? If it's a legitimate case and we have the means to help, then yes, we are obligated to help. James chapter 2, verses 15 through 16 says, "If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit?" James is making the point that simply wishing well-being on others is not the same thing as actually helping them. He is saying if you have the resources but are unwilling to help a fellow believer, then where is this so-called faith? In conclusion, as believers, we are accountable for how we use our resources, whether that be money, assets, or even our time. And one of the ways we're accountable is in how we treat those whom we are supposed to help. But we must also remember that we don't help just because we are obligated to. We should be helping because we want to, because it is one of the ways we can demonstrate a genuine love for other believers. Anybody can say they love and care for someone, but demonstrating that by care and action is what makes it real. Pastor Al shared a story with us last week about a group of men from his church who helped him split his firewood. I'm sure many of you remember that. He shared with us his reluctance to receive help from others. I've known this about Pastor Al. He tends to want to do things himself, and I understand. I tend to be the same way. But anyways, these men were willing to help and wouldn't take no for an answer. You see, they wanted to be a blessing to Al and Margaret because they cared for them. And splitting firewood was one way that they could be that blessing. The point is, they resorted to action, and they gave of their time for a worthy cause. I believe that serves a very good example for us. We don't need to give to every cause out there. Just the ones that are worthy of the investment. And that makes us good stewards of what God has given us. Let's pray. Lord, help us to be generous. Help us to be generous Christians who are always willing to help in the time of need, but also help us to be very discerning. Certainly, I've seen over the years people who were rather wise and were able to get things either done for them or given to them for nothing. Things that they could have earned themselves, but they learned a long time ago that they could get things for nothing. So, Lord, you pray that we'll be wise and discerning when it comes to dealing with those types of people. And Lord, overall, I pray that we'll all be good stewards of what you've given us, whether that be our health, so that we could give of our time to help with physical matters, or finances. I pray that we will not be stingy with our money. I pray that we'll be giving toward those who are in need, those who are qualified, especially those who are brothers and sisters in Christ. And overall, Lord, I certainly pray that you will help us to be good stewards, wise with our money and generous with our money. Certainly do pray that you get us home safely tonight. And I do pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.